Welcome back. Our previous episode explored Western illusions about transforming Muslim societies along liberal democratic lines. We discovered why these transformation efforts often fail due to foundational incompatibility between contrasting civilizational approaches. Today we'll examine the implications of these foundational differences for the future of global civilization. We'll explore three major civilizational worlds and the particular challenges facing Russia as the weakest element caught between different models. This analysis will reveal how societies navigate between contrasting frameworks while attempting to maintain political effectiveness and cultural coherence. The strategically most vulnerable element in the contemporary global network appears to be post-Orthodox and post-Soviet Russia, whose political leadership has twice organizationally rejected the foundational principles of their civilizational identity. This creates cardinal psychological and ultimately political differences between major global civilizational regions: the world of Muslim societies, the world of the Christian West, and the world of Orthodox Christianity. All have been developing for extended historical periods according to monotheistic ideals at their cores. Each defends organized values and expresses civilizational political orientations in distinctive ways. Within each of these worlds, there exists relatively autonomously the world of Judaism, whose main patron and ally is the Protestant Anglo-American coalition. The weakest in this network of civilizational worlds is post-Orthodox and post-Soviet Russia, whose leading elites have at least twice radically rejected the foundational principles of their political subjectivity. The first rejection of subjectivity manifested itself in the destruction of the Orthodox foundational confession as the basis of Russian civilization. This process, which lasted for about 2 centuries, eventually led to the destruction of the 1,000-year-old Russian statehood and the entire society, its institutions, culture, and identity. The result was the tragedy of 1917, the Civil War, and the destruction of orthodoxy as an organizing component of the Russian state. The second refusal, but this time from subjective foundational atheism, was carried out by the partisan leadership elites of the post-Orthodox and post-Stalin Soviet Union. With the delegation of political subjectivity to the leaders of the Protestant West, the atheistic rulers of the late USSR lacked the ability to offer people transcendental and eternal foundational principles for social and political progress, to form spiritual immunity in the Soviet people against the corrupting influence of the West, its ideological sabotage and psychological war as forms of organized expansion. By the beginning of perestroika, the majority of the population of the Soviet Union was infected with bourgeois individualistic and infantile consumerist attitudes. Post-Orthodox and post-Soviet Russia, under the leadership of democracy enthusiasts and advocates of liberalism, without acquiring clear foundational principles for its policies, continues to experience decline. This process has been going on for more than a quarter of a century, accompanied by fruitless talk about the search for a national idea, the acquisition of universal human values, the development of democracy, civil society, and so forth. Researchers Yuriev and Mozorovsky rightly believe that the power networks in the world, in all countries, are becoming less and less effective, because they take into account a very narrow range of motives for political behavior. Thus, the approach that remains prevalent is that the deep foundational and spiritual attitudes of large masses of people are not studied in the network of political science knowledge, and, as a result, are ignored. The crisis of liberal civilization, which having succumbed to the passion of commerce, having exchanged the Bible for a code of human rights and freedoms, strengthened the position of Muslim societies with their capacity for mass impulse and political action. The Western world is rapidly approaching the end of the path that was set in the era of the Reformation and the New Age. The Muslim East, with its ephemeral subjectivity, professing monotheism, is directed toward the archaic past, objectively exacerbating the potential for confrontation with the secular West. This creates a complex strategic situation. Three major civilizational frameworks compete for global influence through different approaches and capabilities. The Christian West, particularly the Protestant Anglo-American coalition, operates through concentrated technological innovation, economic productivity, and organizational efficiency. It maintains global influence despite relatively small populations through what we might call intensive superiority, the Muslim world. With over 1.5 billion people, operates through extensive demographic expansion, territorial influence, and mass mobilization. It seeks global influence through what we might call quantitative advantage. The Orthodox world, particularly Russia, finds itself strategically weakened through repeated rejection of its foundational principles. It lacks both the concentrated capabilities of the West and the demographic advantages of the Muslim world. Within this triangular competition, Judaism maintains a unique position, operating as a distributed network rather than a territorial state. It exercises influence through intellectual capabilities, financial networks, and strategic alliances, particularly with the Protestant Anglo-American powers. The weakness of Russia in this configuration stems from its abandonment of orthodox foundational frameworks without successfully adopting alternative organizational principles. The first abandonment occurred gradually over 2 centuries, as Orthodox Christianity lost its role as the organizing principle of Russian society and politics. This process culminated in the revolutionary upheavals of 1917 and the subsequent Civil War. The second abandonment occurred with the collapse of Soviet atheistic frameworks, without replacement by coherent alternative principles. Instead, Russia attempted to adopt Western liberal democratic models without the historical foundations that make these models effective in their original contexts. This double abandonment left Russia without coherent civilizational identity or effective organizational principles. It became dependent on external models while lacking the internal foundations necessary to implement them successfully. Contemporary Russia struggles to develop effective policies because it lacks what scholars call transcendental foundational principles that could provide coherent direction for social and political advancement. The search for a national idea remains unsuccessful because it attempts to find secular substitutes for what historically required spiritual foundations. The adoption of universal human values fails because these values are actually specific products of Protestant development rather than genuinely universal principles. Meanwhile, the crisis affecting liberal civilization provides opportunities for alternative civilizational approaches. The prioritization of commercial success over transcendental values has weakened the spiritual foundations that originally made Western civilization effective. This spiritual weakness creates vulnerabilities that Muslim societies, with their emphasis on community solidarity and spiritual commitment, are positioned to exploit through demographic expansion and cultural influence. The Western world approaches what may be the culmination of the developmental path established during the Protestant Reformation, having achieved remarkable technological and economic success. It now faces challenges in maintaining the spiritual and cultural foundations necessary for long-term civilizational vitality. The Muslim East directs itself toward spiritual revival and demographic expansion, potentially creating increasing pressure on Western secular approaches through population growth and territorial influence. Orthodox Christianity, particularly as represented by Russia, remains the weakest element in this global configuration, lacking both the concentrated capabilities of the West and the demographic vitality of the Muslim world. The future of global civilization may depend on how these three major frameworks adapt to changing conditions while maintaining their distinctive advantages. The Western approach faces challenges in maintaining spiritual and cultural coherence while preserving technological and organizational superiority. The Muslim approach faces challenges in developing concentrated capabilities while maintaining demographic and spiritual advantages. The Orthodox approach faces challenges in recovering foundational principles while developing both concentrated capabilities and demographic vitality. The outcome of these civilizational encounters will likely determine the character of global society for generations to come. In our final episode, we'll draw conclusions from our entire analysis. We'll examine why Israel remains strategically dominant despite its small size, and explore the psychological factors that develop intellectual capabilities in some civilizational frameworks while limiting them in others. How do foundational principles create lasting civilizational advantages? What can we learn from comparing these different approaches to human organization and development? If you're interested in how civilizational frameworks create different strategic outcomes, subscribe to the channel. In comments, share your observations about how different foundational approaches influence political effectiveness and cultural vitality in regions you know. See you in our final episode, where we'll conclude our comprehensive analysis of monotheism and subjectivity. Welcome back to our final episode. Throughout this series, we have conducted a comprehensive analysis of three monotheistic frameworks and their contrasting approaches to human development and political organization. We've examined how different foundational principles create measurably different civilizational outcomes. Today, we'll draw conclusions from our entire analysis. We'll examine why Israel remains strategically dominant despite its small size, and explore the psychological factors that develop intellectual capabilities in some civilizational frameworks while limiting them in others. This concluding analysis will reveal the fundamental mechanisms that determine civilizational success and strategic influence in the modern world. From our comprehensive examination, we can now understand why small Israel consistently dominates the much larger Muslim world through what we must recognize as intellectual and organizational superiority. The answer lies in the foundational differences between what we have called the subjective triad and subjectless frameworks. Judaism and Christianity, despite their theological differences, both operate through subjective approaches that emphasize human capability and creative potential. Judaism through community subjectivity and collective intellectual development. Christianity through individual subjectivity and personal creative responsibility. In contrast, Muslim societies operate through what our analysis has revealed as fundamentally subjectless frameworks, where human agency is subordinated to predetermined divine will and ritual compliance takes precedence over analytical thinking. This creates what we might call cognitive multipliers in Jewish and Christian societies versus cognitive limitations in Muslim societies, Jewish communities. Through thousands of years of emphasis on textual interpretation, public debate, and analytical thinking, have developed what economists would recognize as compound intellectual advantages. Each generation builds upon the educational and intellectual achievements of previous generations. Early intellectual responsibility through adolescent maturity requirements, universal literacy for all community members, organized interpretation and debate practices, multilingual competency development, integration of analytical and empathetic thinking approaches. These practices create systematic advantages that accumulate over time. Individual Jews benefit from community-wide intellectual development spanning centuries. Community networks provide access to global resources and opportunities. Christian societies, through emphasis on individual dignity and creative capability, have developed what we might call innovation multipliers. Each technological breakthrough enables further breakthroughs. Each educational advancement creates capacity for additional learning. The Protestant tradition, in particular, created frameworks for individual creativity and entrepreneurship that became the foundation for modern technological civilization. Together, Jewish and Christian approaches form what we have identified as the subjective triad, two complementary approaches to developing human potential through either community-based or individual-based subjectivity. In contrast, Muslim societies, despite vastly larger populations and abundant natural resources, consistently demonstrate what our statistical analysis revealed as systematic limitations in scientific achievement, technological innovation, and intellectual development. This is not due to inherent incapacity or cultural deficiency. It results from foundational approaches that optimize for different priorities than intellectual development and creative innovation. Muslim educational and social frameworks optimize for community conformity, spiritual submission, and demographic expansion rather than individual creativity and analytical thinking. These are legitimate civilizational choices, but they produce different outcomes than frameworks that prioritize intellectual development. The result is what we observed in our opening episode. Israel, with 8 million people, consistently defeats much larger Muslim populations through superior technological capability and organizational efficiency. 200 Iranian missiles intercepted by Israeli defense systems. Complete destruction of Iranian air defenses while Israeli aircraft remained undetected. This represents not just military superiority, but systematic intellectual and technological superiority. This pattern extends beyond military affairs. In scientific research, technological innovation, economic development, and cultural influence, small Jewish and Christian communities consistently achieve results that vastly larger Muslim populations cannot match. The Israeli example demonstrates how subjective frameworks, whether Jewish community-based or Christian individual-based, create strategic capabilities that overcome demographic disadvantages. Israeli society benefits from both Jewish intellectual traditions and Western technological frameworks. This combination creates what we might call cognitive synergy that multiplies the capabilities of both approaches. Jewish emphasis on analytical thinking and textual interpretation combines with Western emphasis on individual creativity and technological innovation. The result is a society that punches far above its demographic weight in virtually every measure of intellectual and technological achievement. But the Israeli example also reveals something crucial about the future of civilizational competition. Size and resources, while important, are less decisive than foundational approaches to human development. Countries that develop their human potential through education, analytical thinking, and creative problem-solving consistently outperform much larger countries that prioritize other values. This has profound implications for understanding contemporary global dynamics and future trends. The Muslim world, with over 1.5 billion people and enormous natural resources, remains strategically dependent on much smaller Western and Israeli entities for advanced technology and innovation. This dependency reflects not temporary disadvantages that can be overcome through resource allocation, but systematic differences in foundational approaches to human development that have been accumulating for centuries. Similarly, the weakness of post-Orthodox Russia reflects not temporary political problems but the deeper issue of abandoning foundational principles without successfully adopting effective alternatives. Russia's attempts to adopt Western liberal democratic models without the historical foundations that make these models effective have produced institutional weakness rather than strength. The lesson from our analysis is clear. Civilizational success depends not primarily on population size, natural resources, or military spending, but on foundational approaches to developing human potential. Societies that emphasize analytical thinking, creative problem-solving, individual responsibility, and intellectual development consistently outperform societies that prioritize other values, regardless of their demographic or resource advantages. This explains not only Israeli dominance over much larger Muslim populations, but also Western technological leadership, Jewish intellectual influence, and the strategic weakness of societies that have abandoned their foundational principles. Looking toward the future, these patterns are likely to become more pronounced rather than less. In an increasingly technological and information-based global economy, the advantages of societies that develop human intellectual potential will continue to compound. Meanwhile, societies that optimize for other priorities, whether demographic expansion, resource accumulation, or political control, will find themselves increasingly dependent on externally generated innovation and technology. The psychological factors that develop intellectual capabilities in some civilizational frameworks while limiting them in others are now clear from our analysis. Early intellectual responsibility and analytical thinking requirements, universal education and literacy, public interpretation and debate, individual creativity and problem-solving. These practices, maintained over generations, create systematic advantages that cannot be quickly replicated. In contrast, emphasis on memorization over interpretation, submission over questioning, conformity over creativity, and ritual compliance over analytical thinking create different psychological patterns that limit intellectual development. These differences help explain why Israel, despite its small size and resource limitations, remains strategically invincible against much larger opponents. It operates through civilizational frameworks that maximize human intellectual potential, while its opponents operate through frameworks that limit such development. Our analysis suggests that this strategic advantage will persist as long as these foundational differences remain intact. Israel's combination of Jewish intellectual traditions and Western technological capabilities creates compound advantages that demographic size alone cannot overcome. This concludes our comprehensive examination of monotheism and subjectivity. Through 21 episodes, we have explored how different approaches to ultimate questions create measurably different outcomes in education, innovation, political organization, and strategic capability. The implications extend far beyond any single conflict or region. They help explain fundamental patterns in global development and civilizational competition that will likely shape the future of human society. Thank you for joining us throughout this series. If you found this analysis valuable, please subscribe to the channel and share these insights with others interested in understanding the deep foundations of civilizational development. In comments, share your thoughts on the most important insights from our comprehensive analysis. What implications do you see for understanding contemporary global challenges? Until next time, keep exploring the fundamental questions that shape human civilization.